smart. Name 3 different kinds of nuts.
Walnuts and chestnuts.
That's 2.
And forget-me-nuts.
Lovely.
If you were there, you were a star, or at least the best act on the bill.
What did you take up at school?
Anything that wasn't nailed down.
You're too smart for one girl.
I'm more than one.
You're more than one?
Yeah, my mother has a picture of me when I was 2.
In 1922, when a lackluster dancer and SEAL trainer named Burns teamed up with half of just another sister act named Allen, they moved from everywhere else on the bill to next to closing and stayed there.
We don't open no shows.
All right. You can close the show.
And we don't close any shows.
Well, you'll either open or close the show here.
We must be the only act on the bill.
For performers, the closing spot on a vaudeville bill was called playing to the haircuts, because that's what they saw going up the aisle. To drive audiences away and make room for the new audience, managers would purposely book bad acts for closing. Acts like a one-man harp and ocarina combo.
Remember, that audience was also an antagonist as well as a friend. The old-time vaudevillians. I killed that audience. What happened? I slew them. I murdered them. The words they use are violent words. And so there was a hostility and love, hostility and a hunger, a need, a yearning for adulation. At the same time, there was both. It's very personal. A love-hate relationship was there.
Sometimes we simply killed the audience. They loved it, and sometimes I couldn't get off fast enough.
When I go out in front of an audience, I'm going to a lover.
I said, I'm going to go out there and I'm going to lay them out in the eyes because nobody, I said, is going to take it away from me.
I worked through chickenpox, the mumps, the measles. I must have infected hundreds of people.
Suppose we meet her, Mr. Gallagher?
50-50, Mr. Sheen.
No, I remember Gallagher and Sheehan. When they opened at the Palace, they were a huge success. And they were booked after that in Philadelphia, where they flopped. They didn't even run the week in Philly. It was 90 miles away.
And I said, I don't mind if you walk out on me. It's when you come towards me I get nervous.
The white audiences are harder to please than the black audience. Black audience seemed to be starved for something to see or something to do because they were restricted to certain places.
The black audiences up in Harlem, for example, were tougher on hoofers than any white audience you've ever seen. The white audience will give you a break. The colored audience, if you don't dance, forget it.
There's some chicken wire in an oval shape up in the ceiling. And I said to the boss, I said, what's that? He says, well, on Saturday night they get kind of noisy here, and he says, to protect the band and the orchestra, we lower that.
I once watched my father in a show called The Beauty Part go out on stage and get a big laugh on a conjunction, like but or and. And I just could not understand it. And I said, Dad, how did you know that there was a laugh at that point? And he said, John, I listened to the audience, and they told me where the laugh was.
Hollywood's vaudeville recreations, even those starring ex-vaudevillians, are rarely accurate. Old men dance ancient routines perfectly, without any rehearsal. Reality was different.
In vaudeville, you perfected an act. And I mean perfected it. We used to spend as much as an hour, everyone's, just on how far you down your bow.
My father didn't mind. My father said, oh, she loves to dance. My father was gorgeous and beautiful and terrific. But my mother didn't like the idea. No. She thought just bums are in show business.
It was sort of in their eyes, it was sort of like indecent exposure, you know?
Well, I mean, I was making $40, $50 a week during those days. It was a big money. But I couldn't take any of it home or anything because my father didn't know I was in show business.
In one season, Burt Law and his wife made these 48 stops across North America. Vaudevillians spent their lives on the road. And the Laws had it made. The smallest town they played was Davenport. Before the Marx Brothers hit the big time, they played theaters where the three-piece orchestra was a piano player, a piano, and a stool.
When we traveled in vaudeville, it was kind of rough. We had an old Chrysler that my brother bought, and we just never got the money, never got paid to get on a train or get on a plane or anything like that. So we used to get in the car and go. No matter where we had to go, we went by car. The only way we could save money.
My mother, my father, my two sisters, myself, and the school teacher would all travel in this car. And it was loaded. We had everything that we needed, and the dinner was ready. Mom would cook, a great cook, on a little two-heater stove, you know.
There were some hotels that were very homey, very welcoming. Other hotels didn't want show people at all.
The early parts of vaudeville, you lived in some awfully crummy places. We had to. We didn't all become stars overnight. I never became a star, but I lived like one.
But you worked, I mean, you were a slave. I was absolutely miserable.
I remember being in Los Angeles downtown with my mother, and we had 25 cents, and that was all we had, and we had no job. I was about, I guess 3.5. It was in that part.
But my first paying job, I remember, my husband and I started forming an act together. We got $7 apiece, $14 for the two of us. That's the truth.
I was shocked at being called a drag queen because I was an actor. And then afterwards I said, oh, what the hell, I'm making a living, and that's it. Money is money.
I remember going to the music director one day and asking him if I could have a vacation. He said, you can take all the vacation you want. He said, you don't have to come back.
For one group of vaudevillians, the artist of color, you don't have to come back wasn't just an idle management threat. It was life itself. Vaudeville began in the 1880s, just as the Chinese Exclusion Act took effect, prohibiting Chinese immigration to the United States far into the next century. Vaudeville thrived as the Supreme Court affirmed in Plessy v. Ferguson that separate but equal was constitutionally acceptable. The social and political opportunities for minorities that were established in antebellum America were rapidly disappearing. African Americans and other ethnic groups were being put back in their place. Ironically, one of those places was the stage.
Yes, sir, that's my baby, no, sir, no, man, baby, yes, sir, that's my baby now.
The singer is Italian, his act is Asian, his musical instrument is Hawaiian, and his song was written by a nice Jewish boy. Vaudeville reflected its time, a time when America was becoming a melting pot, whether some Americans liked it or not.
I'm Italian. I'm of Italian ancestry. My real name, many years ago, before Mom and Dad changed it, was Bertonzetti. But it wouldn't fit on the marquee. Nobody wanted to be known really as an Italian. You were really looked down on. Then that went to the Polish people. Then probably from the Polish people to the Jewish people. And then, you know, and the same joke.
There were also Greek stereotypes. There was always the Greek who ran the fruit store down the street, or had the little shop, the delicatessen. God knows there were Jewish stereotypes. There were Italian stereotypes. There were popular songs written in the Greek idiom, in the Jewish idiom, in the Italian idiom. We grew up with those songs. America was about all of those things.
I did an Italian number in my act, where I did very badly broken Italian and sang with a little boy about how we were going to go back to the old country and make spaghetti and have kids and live the proper life, and we'll leave the monkey behind.
All those things that were not valuable to the official culture were very valuable to the pop culture. Their songs, their sounds, their linguistic mistakes, everything was usable.
Tell me right now. Now is the time to do it. Hey, Maya, I got an idea. What is it?
Weber and Fields made a career out of the assimilation mistakes of every ethnicity, but their own. They were born Orthodox Jews, but they never played Jews. They started in blackface, were Irishmen sometimes, and became America's best-known Germans.
No, you dance. Spoil the game. Yeah. You dancing do this against the law. Huh? It's against the law. Well, sue me.
Hasta Vazula, that's the stuff you want to eat. Hasta Vazula, that's the juice that can be beat.
Brooklyn-born Van and Skank were the musical Weber and Fields, building their act around other people's ethnicity. They became Italians, praising Pasta Vazula.
Hungry women.
They were Jews reciting Hungry Women.
Hungry women. I feed them and weep. Oh, they make me dig deep.
They were Chinese singing Chinese Firecracker.
With a hot timing voicing, goi hung, loi hung, a Chinese punk, which means who the hell he put the firecracker under my bunk. China boy, go sleep. Close your eyes, don't peek. Sandman soon will come while I softly hum.
When most Americans only knew their immediate neighbors and worried that every new arriving ethnic group would take their jobs, marry their daughters, and overwhelm their communities, acts like Holy One and his orchestra showed people who didn't know any better that Asians could do something besides laundry and could play something besides the gong.
Miss Toy now sing a famous Chinese song.
Little sing-a-lee, sing-a-lot, afternoon, by the good green, you can mellow moon. Little China boy will be here, feeling love afternoon.
Ming and Toy challenged their stereotype image by laughing at it. Just like Fanny Bryce.
And the guy named Ahmed Hemel that knocked me off my camel. His house has much as funny, my dear. He sold me to the sultan like a guy would sell a cow. The harem days, they call me a name, 'cause I'm his favorite now. I'm Tasha, the obsession of the obsession. Most of his time spent, he's hanging out on my tent. The pressure, his lips, his obsession.
The touching thing about vaudeville is it's like first-generation America getting a foothold in the world of America, singing about it, celebrating it, suffering it, and giving all that longing and high times to the people, giving it back.
As each new immigrant group got more of a foothold in America, they filled more theater seats, and what they saw of themselves on stage changed for the better. Vaudevillians knew you don't get nasty about the Irish in a theater full of Irish. But with African Americans segregated in the balcony, or excluded entirely from the audience, there was no such thing in mainstream vaudeville as a theater full of them. And it was that way for almost a century.
Hey, Skinny! The minstrel show's coming to town!
Beginning in the 1840s, the minstrel show, was America's first entertainment craze.
It started with northern white performers who observed blacks or Negroes or slaves at that point really entertaining themselves.
Say, I have an idea.
Yes.
You be around here about a half hour before the show.
You mean you're gonna let me watch up close?
Jim Crow, you'll practically be right on the stage.
Woo! Wheel about and turn about, change and
Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow.
Give me back my clothes, please.
What they did was to imitate some of the actions they saw, some of the songs that they saw these slaves singing, and to put on grease paint or blackface.
Blacks had little power to protest their characterizations, although many tried. Whites could parody them, but they could parody no one but themselves. Eventually, African Americans formed their own minstrel companies, billing themselves as real Negro delineators. Whites couldn't compete with their authenticity and often their talent, so they turned their own minstrel shows into vaudeville. But blackface characterizations were still an essential part of the act.
That's what the minstrels are here for, so stand up and cheer for those grand old minstrel days.
At the same time, African Americans were being lynched by the hundreds and shunned by mainstream society. They were the subjects of the most popular music of the time, so-called coon songs, that, like minstrel shows, depicted black life as free, careless, and non-threatening to anyone. Whites were led to believe that this young man's sole desire was to sing and dance for them.
If I saw a blackface performer at that time, I guess I was in my early teens on Vaudeville. I didn't think anything of it because it was the time that I was living. It was the late 20s. I can look back now. I dislike having to say this, but I realize my mother and father were bigots. But I think everybody in Chicago were bigots.
Sitting by the river on a summer evening, listening to the darkest hum.
White vaudevillians maintained that white fantasy begun during minstrel times, that separate but equal was okay with Mammy, and that blacks were simple, happy creatures who loved to entertain and had lots of time to do it, with just a little cotton picking here and there between fish fries and steamboat arrivals.
Listening to the steamboat blow.
The myth lasted a very long time, as Topsy and Eva, vaudeville's Duncan sisters, were still working it in 1960. The Duncans were the last minstrels. Real African Americans were forced to go along with the myth by wearing ridiculous or stereotyped clothing on stage, and only playing versions of Sambo or Zip Coon.
Because Sambo was the willing retainer. He was that slave who would sing songs like Carry Me Back to Old Virginia. On the other hand, Zip Coon then becomes an aggressive black man who's still ignorant, but is pretentious.
Black performers almost always had to be in a racial context.
I don't know why I feel this way.
Eunice Wilson sings a fine number that has nothing to do with fruits and vegetables. So why does she have to do it in front of giant watermelons?
How the
you give in. I won't give up because I'm sure to win. Because I don't know why I feel this way.
I remember once I had added a wonderful song called Shoeshine Boy to my repertoire. And it was a perfect song for a kid of 12, 13 to sing. And I sang this song. I had an arrangement of it with an orchestra and so forth. And I was booked into the Oriental Theater in Chicago. And there was a wonderful theater with a wonderful line of chorus girls and a great choreographer and producer and so forth. And when she heard about the colored boy coming to work at the theater, her mind began to click, apparently. And when I got there, she had a whole big production number about Shoeshine Boy. And of course, I was in it. And I had to give up my nice arrangement and then perform in her production, which included running up and down the chorus girls in front of them with a shoeshine cloth and shining their shoes. And my nice white tail suit had been tossed aside, and I was wearing some kind of stylized version of tatters and rags. That was my final week in vaudeville.
Now I remember as a kid, hold on there now. Now Sapphire done told me that you owes me a nickel.
And I used to go like, why do he talk like, to my mother, why do he talk like that?
The white performers who did minstrelsy did not really do black comedy at all. I mean, the jokes had nothing to do with blacks whatsoever. They were basically gags that were taken, and they were of show business origin. They were riddles and gags taken from the northern stage. When blacks came in, you had the emergence of an authentic form of black entertainment, although they still veiled it with the stereotypes that had been set up by the white performers.
The definition for acting is to do. All of this is an act.
Leonard Reed is an African-American who played in both all-white and all-black vaudeville.
I told you why they put on cork. Not to be black, but to get the expressions from the face. When you put on cork and white lips, you can move your lips around and everybody can see them moving around, and that's a laugh. And I think anything that you can do to get a laugh should be in show business. Show business is show business.
And I think that burnt cork for a lot of those vaudevillians was a mask so that when they came off stage, they could disappear into the crowd and nobody would know who they were.
Almost all the black comedians before 1950 wore blackface, even for black audiences. In the beginning, they had to.
Yeah, let me tell you about that bull of my father's. You see, right,
But some wanted to, like the great comedian Dewey Pigmeat Markham.
5 o'clock. And that bull is so fast and so smart, every afternoon about 5 o'clock, he goes way up to the 40, that pasture, and race that train 5.5 miles.
Oh, yeah?
Would you believe it? That bull beat that train by 1/2 mile.
No.
Mm-hmm.
Some bull.
I know it's some bull.
And when Pigmeat took off his cork, he lost the edge that he had in laughter. I said, Pigmeat, what's happening? I said, the bit isn't going. He said, I don't know, I can't express myself anymore. He said, they made me take off the cork, and the cork was not to prove that I was black. They knew I was black. He said, Negro, that's what he said, but I just lost the edge. I can't feel like I felt when I had the cork on. And he was broken-hearted till the end. Pigmeat was broken-hearted till the end that he had to take off cork.
Pigmeat Markham was one of the last American performers to take off the mask. His fans were surprised to discover that his face was darker than his makeup. He had been lightening up, not blacking up, for 40 years. In mainstream vaudeville, only one black act was allowed per show, if that. But black performers did have a place to work and learn their craft, the Toba circuit.
The TOBA circuit consisted of a whole black theater circuit starting with Chicago Grand Theater to St. Louis to Kansas City to Tulsa to Oklahoma City. I get excited just thinking about, realize this has been 70 years ago since I did these dates.
On the Toba circuit, monologist Moms Mabley developed a routine that spanned 6 decades.
They fired me. Of course, when they fired me, when I lose my job, I lose my man. That is, since I got, well, kind of old, you know. Now, don't get me wrong, it ain't no disgrace to be old. But darn, if it ain't inconvenient, I can tell you that much about it. Knock me out, Luther. I love to dance. At least I used to love to dance.
Am I blue? Am I blue? Aching tears in these eyes telling you.
There was a lot for artists to be blue about Working Toba, an acronym that stood for Theater Owners Booking Association. But for performers, it always meant tough on black asses. White owners, bad theaters, hardly any pay, and mostly in the South.
'Cause there was a time when I was his only one, but now I'm the sad and lonely one, Lordy.
They call up and say, Bailey, we got a nigger here says he's yours. His name is so-and-so, and Bailey would say, yeah, that's one of my niggas. He's at the theater. Let him alone. And they would let him go. You could not walk the street after dark in the South?
Pardon me. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like it this time.
Phone just rang.
This one here?
Didn't you hear it?
Oh, no, I didn't. Hello?
What's the matter with this guy?
Yes? Mr. Reed's office. Mr. Reed? Yes, for you.
Must be for me. Got to make him think you're big time. Yeah. Always have a secretary.
He's big. Hello? Yes,
Leonard Reed and Willie Bryant became stars at the Apollo in New York, like the Toba Theaters, a place where African-American performers could work before their peers to find their own voices in their own communities. But to become national stars, they had to deal with the white world, and that was really easy.
As a young black performer, I was not allowed to stay in many of the hotels where I worked. I think that's, to people who are young today, unimaginable, but it's quite true.
We never saw them at the same hotel we stayed at. And they tried to keep this from the kids. But I knew as a kid that the black people and the ethnic people had to go miles out of the way to get to a boarding house or get to a place that would serve them food.
If it was a white, bill, and the white audiences, white people on the stage and everything, they would want us to stay in a black hotel, But, and that's another thing where my brother and I, we sort of tried to clip that down too, and go stay in the hotels where the other people stayed.
Heaven's peace. Hey, that's Mommy. Yeah? Yeah, man. Well, all right then. Put my trust in good for dust. 'Cause you know someday it may bring you a seven.
Through talent, courage, and a refusal to be stereotyped, some performers overcame, like the Nicholas brothers.
Yeah!
Naturally, we're going to say no if they ask us to blackface and put on tramp thing. No, they never did ask us that. I mean, in all the years that we've been in show business, I think they thought we'd be out of character to do that because they always see us in the tuxedos and the tails with class and grace and all that.
Maybe that's why we never got too many parts in movies, because we wouldn't do the mammy scene, and stuff like that. So.
Huey Blake always wore a dinner jacket on stage. He was proud of his music and insisted on showing that pride. Of all the vaudeville performers who overcame huge obstacles to achieve success and dignity, the first, the greatest, was Bert Williams. He started out a minstrel in 1893 and by 1910 was the most respected comedian on the American stage.
Bert Williams' Sambo character, although he himself said it was the same shuffling nigger that was being portrayed by other people, was done with such subtlety that he came across as a human being.
Bert Williams mesmerized the audience. As a matter of fact, one of the bits that he did in the 1919 Follies was a shoe store, and he describes how the shoes are too tight. And my dad, who was a straight man, he says, well, what size do you wear? He says, well, I wear 10s, but 11s feel so good, I wear 12s.
He just seemed to relax, and everyone knew there was going to be a punchline, but he waited and waited, and he milked it for all it was worth. And then he would say the punchline very calmly. And his sense of timing was remarkable.
Sat on his knees, as a matter of fact, when I was about 5 years old. He was a very nice, kindly gentleman. And all business.
In the 1916 film, The Natural Born Gambler, Bert Williams recreated one of his most famous sketches, a mime poker game performed alone. Bert Williams was, as Robert Townsend says, the Jackie Robinson of show business. Not only the first black American to star with an otherwise white cast on Broadway, but the first black American in our history to be admired and respected by people of all races. He died in 1922, only 46 years old. He worked himself to death, trying to prove something he had already proved decades before, many times over. The most successful vaudevillians, no matter what their ethnicity, had one reoccurring problem. Weber and Fields had the problem for 60 years.
You take the knife like this, you shove the knife down the oyster's throat.
Their shapes, their costumes, and their act were instantly recognizable.
Like this, you shove the knife down the oyster's throat.
And cut his teeth out.
Yeah, no, you don't cut his teeth out. You take the oyster out of the overcoat.
He's got the overcoat.
Assuredly.
I wish I had mine. I got the ticket.
You lay the oyster down and you get a can.
And rush the duck.
No, you don't rush the duck. You get a can full of beer. Beer, there is no beer in this.
Then I can't do the trick.
You get the...
Except this isn't Weber and Fields. It's two other guys. They call themselves impressionists or impersonators, but the impersonated call them thieves.
Hey, what is that you got there?
Why, that's a newspaper.
I thought it was wrapping paper.
That's the evening news.
It feels like a post.
Father accused, not only did he accuse people of imitating him, there were people's names we couldn't mention in the house. He'd get so angry. And Danny Kaye we couldn't talk about. And we couldn't talk about Burl.
All of me
cannot take all of me.
Composer Gerald Marks wrote the classic All of Me and sold it to singer Belle Baker. All of Me became associated exclusively with Belle Baker and Irving Berlin.
I got used to reading in the paper every once in a while that Irving Berlin wrote All of Me. The first time it makes you mad, but then you get used to it. And then when I'd occasionally run into Berlin on Broadway, every single time he saw me, he said, "Hey, how do you like the way my song is doing?"
By 1932, Henry Ford's Motor Company had turned out 186 million vehicles.
I don't want to wake up.
Shirley Temple, the greatest of all kid acts, made her first movie in 1932.
Now is the time to fight for the best interest of our city.
Fiorello LaGuardia tried to outlaw burlesque. And there was only one all-vaudeville theater left in America, the Palace.
The Palace was open in New York. We had a contract to go in there, and it's supposed to be a high epitome of everything, to go work the Palace. Not to us, we would work in Harlem, anywhere. So we had the contract, the damn theater closed. It finished.
Landy Lane, don't shine away on the sunshine. You're the girl, everybody knows it's the sun.
After more than a decade in bad health, vaudeville was circling the drain. To too many people, it looked like this: tired old routines performed in big empty theaters by tired old men. Times had changed, and vaudeville hadn't.
Change is the law of life, and you have to adapt to different circumstances. If you don't change, you die.
We were cowards. Vaudevillians were a bunch of cowards. We were afraid to try some new material.
I worked the $1 Million Circuit for a little while. I was at the close of it. I think I closed vaudeville. I was the end of it because it was just a dance act. And dance acts, that's what happened to vaudeville. You started losing the novelty acts, and you started getting too many singers, too many dancers, just too many. It became boring.
If you had a great act and you were booked across the circuit, they didn't want you to change your act. That's what they booked, that's what they wanted.
It got so with many of the acts that the audience knew the act as well as the fella performing.
That is what finally killed vaudeville, because we would play the same theater year after year, year after year, with exactly the same act. And every vaudevillian was the same way.
Audiences found other places to go, exciting new places that were still convenient and cheap. And they didn't have to give up vaudeville.
They would buy an act and put them on a two-reel, and it was so sad because if it was a dumb act, you know, an act that didn't speak or sing, but it was an act that did novelty things, once they did that on film, there was no place to go anyway. The film went. You didn't. That was starvation.
All right, everybody quiet, please. After the bell. All the time in the tropical climb, away to do that sunny, sunny dance. I fell in love with a tropical dove while doing that sunny, sunny dance. All the little kids, she never did have a bit of love.
The 1926 film demonstrating sound production techniques is also an opportunity to watch vaudevillians Witt and Berg give away their act. It was a good act, and nice to have it saved forever on film. But nobody ever heard of Witt and Berg again.
And we can wiki, wiki, wacky world. How are you? I'm glad to be back too. How are you?
Some vaudeville theaters became cinemas with live acts between features. Vaudeville drew the crowds originally, but eventually the vaudevillians were called coolers because their job was to fill the time it took the projectors to cool.
Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is only about like an hour and 20 minutes or an hour and 25 minutes long. So every time the movie ended, we have to do a show. And that's where third day, I was exhausted, I collapsed, and they carried me off to the hospital. But that is how I became a choreographer.
I played 8 shows a day when I played the Paramount in New York. We'd do a show, a movie, a show, a movie. And in those days, I can't understand some of these people who think that one show a night is too much work for them.
Movies were bad for vaudeville, but in some ways, radio was worse. It came directly to people in their homes. You could attend in your underwear if you wanted to. And in 1932, when almost a quarter of the audience was unemployed, radio was all free.
People stayed home. And we wanted to hear it. We would cluster around a radio backstage.
Bands had always been in vaudeville, but when radio made them famous, they took over the whole show with live acts thrown in between sets, but only a few. For the majority of vaudevillians, the handwriting was on the screen. First the big screen, and then the little one.
I know when Milton Berle first started to do his Tuesday night show, and say we were working one of the theaters in town, you could shoot a cannon up the aisle there. Nobody'd get hurt.
And acts on the bill saying, well, we bought a restaurant, or we going into the hotel business, or we're going to open a saloon or something, or anything. And people scrambling to save their lives and save themselves with dignity.
Artists looked everywhere for work. State fairs. Nightclubs and resorts, like New York's Catskills, where pros like Leo Fuchs and Yetta Swirling could still do their stuff. Vaudeville had always been a major American export, and that increased. Australian headliners like the contortionists Napier and Yvonne found themselves sharing the bill with American performers who couldn't find work back home. But the majority of vaudevillians stayed where they were and tried to adapt. Some were fantastically successful, but for every artist who made it elsewhere, there were 1,000 others who couldn't.
Won't you come and let me rock you in my cradle of love? We'll cuddle all the time. Oh, I want a loving baby, and it might as well be you. Pretty baby of mine.
Headliner Ruth Edding retired voluntarily, saying there wasn't much satisfaction singing into a microphone. She was the exception. Most were like chanteuse Raquel Miller. She was very famous once, a genius, according to Sarah Bernhardt. But she just disappeared.
I think that most of the vaudevillians didn't make it. They didn't know what was required, and I think that most of them got lost.
I never could make it in television because I could not remember. Vaudevillians were so used to what they were doing that you threw something new at them, they'd get lost. Only a few from vaudeville actually ever made it in television and movies. A handful, that's about it.
They finally got in the interview at 20th Century Fox for a movie. And I talked to the casting guy. Not long, because he said, "Hey, I saw you at the Palace last week. If we ever get a part in a picture where a guy throws stuff around the stage, we're going to call you." Now, it took me 20 years to get over that. I figured, these guys can't be that dumb. They are.
Artists of color discovered that the new media were less welcoming than vaudeville. For the dance team Toy and Wing, there was no place to go. Not many films, not much television.
I've had white people say that to me. Like, if you were white, Fayard, think of the things that could have happened to you doing the things that you do and being white. 20th Century Fox should have starred us in movies. But because of the color of my skin, they didn't do it. And they knew how great we were. If it had been two white dancers, bam, right away.
Mother didn't think vaudeville was over. Mother thought vaudeville would come back. She always thought that. Wherever she is, she probably still does.
Vaudeville died, but it's always had a lively corpse. During World War II, both headliners and acts that hadn't worked in decades went out again to entertain the troops. Vaudevillians knew how to satisfy people who desperately needed an escape because they had spent their lives learning how. Vaudeville was the great teacher.
What do you want to hear? Huh? What is that, the bumblebee? You couldn't have stayed home today. I mean, you had to be in it.
We're still living off the energy of vaudeville. If you like Bob Hope, if you like Bert Lahr, if you like the Marx Brothers, if you like W.C. Fields, you know, if you like Buster Keaton, if you like Charlie Chaplin, well, where they went to school in vaudeville.
All the black vaudevillians, you know, made it easier because they broke ground. You know, like when we, you know, talk about Bert Williams, because he was the first African American to perform, he made it acceptable. I mean, I think without all these different performers, no, I wouldn't be here.
And what I learned in vaudeville was hit 'em fast, get the laughs, and which later on paid off because I did the Ed Sullivan show, and Sullivan says, "Can you do a minute and a half?" And I said, "Beautiful, right up my alley."
It's called The Rabbit from the Chapeau. Always something new, huh? A few passes over the hat with the old dusteroo, passes over the hat inside. What happened to the duster? Watching pretty close, aren't you? Oh, how I hate a sneaky audience. That's the worst kind. Come in, I better hang this back up. Inside! Inside the hat, Peter, the little tiny bunny. Get ready, Pete. I'm coming down to get you. Here we go. This may come as news, but I doubt it. No rabbit.
We were taught our business. There's the best thing I've said. We were taught our business.
It wasn't just the big stars who carried on vaudeville's skills and traditions.
I must have a lover who's free for me, and I'd be more than satisfied.
But people like Virginia McMath, too. Just another girl singer from Independence, Missouri, who learned her craft in vaudeville and picked up a new name along the way, Ginger Rogers.
To prove that he loves just one, 6 Romeo fought a gun. Shot himself just for fun. No, I can't give up that much.
Thelma White kept her name, but like Ginger Rogers, went on to film, musical comedy, and her own all-girl orchestra. She played one of the pushers in the cult classic, Reefer Madness.
What do you want?
Bring me some reefers.
Before retiring with her husband, female impersonator Maurice Tony Millard, to Van Nuys, California.
Wish I knew just where to go. Can't go on this way, I know.
Leonard Reed became a choreographer, teacher, and the comic sidekick of heavyweight champion Joe Louis. June Havoc applied her vaudeville experience to a distinguished career on stage and screen. Television benefited from many vaudevillians like Rose Marie, Maury Amsterdam, and Carl Ballantine, the original crazy sitcom character man.
I could tell you of dozens of guys that are making big bucks today that I inspired.
When CBS canceled his show in 1972, Ed Sullivan said, "Vaudeville has died its second death." He was talking about format, the every few minutes something different rule of vaudeville that television still follows. Especially in this multi-channel world that turns every viewer with a remote control into a vaudeville producer.
When you speak of channel surfing, that's interesting. The man, woman at home creates her own vaudeville bill. I say switching from sports, suddenly it's dull. The guy hit a home run with the bases full and the score is one, so you switch to a comedy act, or for that matter, to a documentary. And so that's the vaudeville act, isn't it? There's the comic, there's the serious, there's the acrobatic. It's all there. That's a new form. Still, doing that, isn't there a kind of onanistic quality here? Isn't that kind of doing it by yourself to yourself?
5, 6, 7, and hop. 2, 3. Up you go. 1, 2. And around. And 1, 2, 3. Up with the arms.
Channel surfers aren't the only modern do-it-yourself vaudevillians. The medium continues, not quite dead, because we still want to sing and dance, laugh and wonder.
3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Many of the dances are still being done today. The soft shoe, for instance, even the buck and wing, still become an essential part of choreography on the Broadway stage, and they were certainly a part of choreography on the vaudeville stage.
Every entertainment form has borrowed from vaudeville. Professional sports has giveaways, ladies' night, and Take Me Out to the Bowl Game, written by vaudevillian Jack Norworth. Even politics has vaudevillian connections.
Now, my wife, as I said, knows I won't write for people unless I know what they do. I said, honey, how do you like that? This afternoon, President Johnson called me, wants me to write some jokes for him. She says, tell him you don't write for him till you see him work.
Animated cartoons may be the most vaudeville-esque entertainments we have today. So it's not surprising that Gertie the Dinosaur, in 1904, one of the first animated cartoons, was created by Winsor McKay to use in his vaudeville act.
This is a little thing that came to me in the middle of the night.
The stand-up comedians of vaudeville, Fred Allen, Doc Rockwell, Frank Fay, developed many of the techniques and the jokes still in constant use.
The title of this poem is A Jockey's Lament. It has something to do with a jockey. It's a shame she'll never be fancied again. She's putting on weight and she's gone in the feet. When she jumped, you could see it was a terrible strain. She's old and she's fat and she does nothing but eat. Hey, hey.
Frank Fay, the vaudeville, had an easy way, a sort of weltschmerzy, world-weary way, Fay swooning, Fay going away. So I always thought of, whenever I see William Buckley on TV, I think Frank Fay, because they both have that same fade-away quality.
Okay, and now for your amazement and
Some vaudeville connections to contemporary entertainment are obvious.
Gonzo the Great will grow a tomato plant whilst playing the 1812 overture on the violin.
The international super hit Muppet Show took place in a vaudeville theater.
This act may not last long. In fact, it's over.
One legacy of live variety entertainment has been directly represented by a group of performers, sometimes called New Vaudevillians.
In our cultural memory, there is, even those of us who are too young to have really seen vaudeville, there is a cultural, almost dreamlike memory of something that occupied this place in people's lives and this force of theatrical energy. And it often has to do with a certain look and a certain feel, a certain historical style and a certain kind of physical action. And if you could touch on that, then an audience will be very moved by it.
And what all these people have learned, I can't say it too often, is they learned how to corrupt an audience with pleasure. And there is no harder or more noble thing in the theatrical profession than to do that.
You love a business, you do it, and you get paid for it. How can you beat a combination like that? It's just magnificent. We loved it.
What I've given up? I don't think I've given up anything because I enjoyed what I was doing.
I loved it. And so did my brother. We had a ball.
What am I proudest of? I'm proudest of that the brother and I, or me, got the opportunity to do what we wanted to do on stage. And nothing took that away from us, you know. We did it all.
Major funding for American Masters is provided by the National Endowment for the Arts, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by the annual financial support of viewers like you. Additional funding was provided by Rosalind P. Walter, Jack Rudin, and the Andre and Elizabeth Cortege Foundation.
Vaudeville, an American Masters special, is available on home video cassette for $29.95 plus shipping. To order, call 1-800-336-1917 or write to the address on your screen.
This is PBS.